Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to your online lecture 3A here in Biology 140. Here in online lecture 3A, the first lecture preparing you for test 3 is we could cover chapter 4 slides 2 through 16. So we're looking at chapter 4 slides 2 through 16. And as you can see from this title on this first slide, we will be talking about evolution today. Evolution is a big topic all throughout biology and environmental biology as well. It will help us understand a little bit about the organisms that we have and that exist in different parts of the world. It will give you some background on that anyway. And, whether you firmly believe in evolution or not, it's good to at least logically think through this process. Again, assuming the premises are true, and just kind of follow the logic through as we go through these next few slides. And so that's all I'm asking you to do here is just to follow the logic of what's presented, and then hopefully you'll be able to kind of see the world maybe from a different angle too. So what we're going to do today is watch 2 videos throughout this lecture, and probably go ahead again, finish around slide 16. So why do we have this picture here, guys? This first picture here on slide number 2. It's a beautiful picture, certainly. It's got a beautiful landscape, some beautiful little lagoon here in the foreground. But what is this? Does anybody know what part of the world this is? This is just off the coast of South America, and you guessed it, it is the Galapagos Islands. Correct. Yes, the Galapagos Islands, where Charles Darwin and his team, of course, the team that he was with, was more interested in mapping the Galapagos Islands, but Charles Darwin was interested in the natural history of the island. He was interested in seeing what was living out there, what unique species were on the islands, and there were some very unique species. We'll see that his study of the Galapagos Island finches and tortoises and cormorants, blue-footed boobies, and a few other organisms he studied in these islands were especially interesting to him, and they helped him to formulate the theory of evolution. So let's go to slide 3. Now slide 3 is an outline. So let's go ahead and just kind of look at that. We're going to look at evolution and how that might lead to species diversity and possibly get into species interactions. But mainly we're going to focus on evolution and how evolution could possibly lead to perhaps new adaptations, new traits, or even a whole new species. So let's start here on slide 4 officially here. I'll go ahead and switch to slideshow view, and we'll begin to go through these slides. So let's go ahead and pull up the information here on the first slide. Let's back up a tad. Let's see, I don't want to go too far. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this first slide entitled Adaptation. All right, well, adaptations are the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment. All right, so for example, camels. Camels have several adaptations that allow them to survive in a desert environment. Can you think of any? Well, camels actually have several layers of eyelashes. And why would you want to have several layers of eyelashes? Because it's fashionably cool? Well, I don't know if that's ever been a trend before, but who knows? Big eyelashes are a big thing, right, in our culture. But how about camels trying to protect their eyes from those terrible sand particles and those sandstorms? So, yeah, they have that. What else? Well, camels, down in their hooves, they have a piece of skin that bridges the gap between their hooves, between the two, the members of a pair there. You know how the hooves are divided into 2 keratin pieces. Well, there's a piece of skin there. Why would you have that? Well, it keeps you from sinking into the sand. So there's a little piece of skin that, again, binds the 2 parts of the hoof together. What else? Well, they have that large characteristic hump. And that hump is, of course, there to store large amounts of fat, which allows them to handle long times without food. And it also, of course, stores very large amounts of water. I think that it's been estimated they can take in 40 gallons of water, can store that much possibly at one time. Crazy. That's 160 pounds of water. So they have all kinds of, like a large stomach, they have all kinds of adaptations that allow them to handle the desert environment. Polar bears have completely different adaptations, like black skin, which absorbs the sunlight, keep them warmer, very thick fatty tissue, almost like a blubber, webbed feet, and they also have long noses, which helps warm the air as it goes into their bodies. So lots of adaptations for the polar bear in the polar environment. So anytime you acquire a trait that allows you to survive better in your environment or to cope with your environmental, I guess, strains, we might call it, that's an adaptation. And that's explained by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So how did the camel get the extra layers of eyelashes? How did the camel develop that piece of skin there? How did the camel develop its hump? Well, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution attempts to explain how the camel received its adaptations and how the polar bear received its adaptations. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about evolution. And then we'll watch a video after this slide here. So evolution is where we have a trait that must be inherited or must be passed genetically from parent to offspring in order for it to evolve. So in evolution, the claim is that individuals with traits that make them suited to a particular environment survive and reproduce at a greater rate, that's the key, greater rate in that environment than individuals with less suitable traits. So if you have camels, some with several layers of eyelashes and some with only one layer of eyelashes, which group of camels will survive better in the desert? Of course, the ones with several layers of eyelashes. They'll be able to see better, their eyes will receive less damage, and if they can see better, they can avoid predators, they can find food better, they're better suited. And they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to reproduce successfully. It's kind of like this, guys. Imagine if we have a population of rabbits. Okay, so here's my bad rabbit drawing. So here we go. Got the little rabbits here. And some are dark colored and some are light colored. Okay, so we got these dark colored rabbits, we got these light colored rabbits, and they're living in an environment where it's pretty, say, light in color. Okay, so lots of snow. So we got this snowy landscape all around them. And the dark colored rabbits, and again there's the light colored rabbits, and in this light environment, which one is more likely to survive? Right, the light colored rabbits are more likely to survive when there's lots of snow and a light background. Well, let's say because of global warming, this area becomes less and less snowy. We have less and less snow on the ground, and now the light colored rabbits stand out because the background has now become dark with the lack of snow. So the dark colored rabbits are now blending in better. Over time, this population of rabbits, which includes dark and light colored, there's variety in this population. There's always been dark and there's always been light, but now it starts shifting more towards the dark. And so over time, the rabbits become darker and darker in color, and there's a time where maybe the light colored rabbits actually completely disappear and the entire population becomes dark. So that's the idea of evolution, guys. As simple as that is an adaptation, and that adaptation came through natural selection, where nature first selected to allow the light colored rabbits to survive best, and then over time nature sort of changed its mind. Through global warming it became darker, and now nature is selecting for the dark colored rabbit to survive better. So, it may be a period of time where nature is selecting for one variety and then it switches to a whole different variety. And so in evolution you have to have two basic things. You have to have variation, all right? So we had to have both dark and light colored. You have to have some variation in your population. And not only do you have to have variation, you have to have natural selection, where nature chooses one variety over the other. If nature doesn't really care, if you're just as likely to survive, whether you're dark or light, you won't have evolution occur. You have to have natural selection choosing one over the other. either dark or light, not both equally. If they were being, again, chosen both equally and both were equally as likely to survive, then there would be no evolution. You have to have variation in the population and natural selection. And notice too, guys, that when evolution occurs, it happens at the population level. It doesn't happen at the organism level, like the individual level. It's not like one rabbit evolves. No, the whole population, the group of rabbits that are living in the area and reproducing with each other, that population is what evolves. And that's a big misconception in evolution. People think that it's individuals that evolve. It's the population that evolves. Okay, so let's hold off on natural selection. Let's take you to a little video which will show you a little bit more about Darwin and the Galapagos Islands. And these are actual footage of the Galapagos. Very beautiful.
The HMS Beagle spent 5 weeks mapping the Galapagos. Charles Darwin took every opportunity to go ashore and study island life. He explored from coastline to highland and discovered freshwater pools alive with birds. Darwin reasoned that the islands had been colonized by species of plants and animals from South America, but he was puzzled. He had been taught that species were fixed in nature, created by God. He believed that species could not change into something entirely new. But he had to believe his eyes. The plants and animals of the Galapagos were not identical to those on the mainland. It was as if they'd been transformed since their arrival on the islands. Darwin would spend decades making sense of his observations. But for now, he collected specimens by the trunkful. If Darwin had been older or more experienced, he might have paid more attention to the giant tortoises. He ate their meat, but didn't take away any adult specimens. On the island of Floriana, he failed to grasp an important clue about these creatures. He met an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson, who claimed he could tell which island a tortoise came from by the distinctive shape of its shell. Darwin didn't realize it at the time, but giant tortoises are one of the strongest examples of evolution in the Galapagos.
Okay, just in case you're wondering what it was about those tortoises that was significant. Well, you know, the thing about those tortoises, they, depending on which island they live on, some tortoises have a notch in their shell. And that little notch allows them to lift their necks up a lot higher to reach fruits, like fruit off cacti, or to reach up to plants. Others don't have that notch. They can't lift their heads up as high. And depending on which island you're on, you'll see different tortoises with different shaped shells. And turns out that the islands that have vegetation that's up higher also have tortoises that have the notch. And islands that have vegetation that's lower to the ground, you'll find tortoises that don't have the notch. So again, suggesting that the tortoises have adapted to their vegetation diet there. Whether the fruit or the vegetation is high or low, again, completely determines whether they have the notch or not. So yeah, that's another thing that he looked at. Of course, the finches were probably the most powerful examples of evolution and natural selection. So let's go ahead and start talking more about this natural selection thing here. Okay, so we got natural selection here, and let me get back to our, there we go, I just want to get our highlighter working here. Okay, there we go. Looks like it's going to, okay, there we go. All right, so let's talk about natural selection again. So natural selection is the process of where better selected individuals passing their traits to the next generation. So it's where nature chooses, if you will, which individuals will survive and which ones don't. Of course, nature doesn't really choose. It's not thinking. Natural forces, we don't think of them as thinking, right? Like the winds or colder temperatures or whatever. But nature, in a sense, which would include weather and soil types and predators and prey and all these different factors, is what we might call nature and natural selection. And those factors choose who will be more likely to survive. And you might be wondering, in natural selection, well, as I said before, you have to have variety, right? You remember that. You have to have variation and you have to have natural selection. So we have to have variety. Well, how do we get our variety? Where do the differences in the genes from within individuals come from? The variety comes from mutations. So what happens is you have a mutation, a change in the DNA coding sequence that occurs by random chance. They are random. They've done studies on mutations, and they found they are indeed random. And they can be mistakes in DNA replication. They could be because of an exposure to radiation, toxins. There are a lot of different things that can cause mutations. Like when someone goes out in the sun and they're struck with UV rays, they don't have sunscreen, there can be a mutation in the skin leading to a mole, leading to even skin cancer. So we have chemicals, radiation, mistakes in when the cell's doing its various cellular processes. Cells can make mistakes, and that leads to mutations, changes in the DNA. And those changes, guys, lead to variation. So, for example, back to the turtles. How do we get some turtles that have the notch in the shell? Well, that probably came through a mutation. So there was some change in the DNA caused by, who knows, maybe a chemical, maybe a mistake in DNA replication, who knows what, which led to a little notch there in the shell, and that notch in the shell allowed their necks to go higher, lift up higher to reach more food, especially higher, taller vegetation, and that would have really helped. And now the turtles that have the notch are much more likely to survive on that island. Those that don't have the notch are less likely to survive, and before you know it, the whole island might be teeming with turtles that have the notch, and those that don't have the notch might even just disappear. You see how natural selection works, guys? So nature is acting on variety or variation, and that variation comes from mutations. Okay? All right, so that's kind of the that's what we call neo-Darwinism, and that's the more modern view of evolution. Let's go ahead and look at some things that will determine where a species can live. All right, so now we've looked at natural selection. We've looked at evolution. We've looked at some basics here. Now let's apply natural selection and our understanding of evolution to this issue of where an organism can live. There are environmental factors that determine where an organism can live, including, like, for example, we have wolves living in Canada, timber wolves, and they live even into Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin, a few parts of Idaho, Montana, a little bit of Wyoming, but they're not in much other places in the United States. There's a subspecies that lives around Arizona, New Mexico, but we don't have wolves in a lot of states. What is it that causes them to only live in a few states in the United States? Like, why don't we have timber wolves roaming the southern Appalachians? Well, there's a couple things. Physiological stress could be part of the reason, due to inappropriate levels of moisture, temperature, pH, light, and nutrients. Like, for example, a cactus would struggle to live in this area, whereas an oak tree would struggle to live in the desert. That's due to physiological stress. So you plant a big, western North Carolina red oak tree in Phoenix, Arizona, and you don't provide enough moisture, it will die. It's going to be strained because there's very dry there. The temperature gets ridiculously high at times. The pH of the soil is actually quite different, probably a lot more alkaline. Too much light, really. And then even nutrients, especially organic matter, may be low in the desert. So the oak tree won't live there. Competition with other species, sometimes that's the issue, guys. Sometimes it's, hey, your physiology is fine. You can handle the environment. It's of the appropriate temperature, moisture, and pH, etc. But there's another species there that you just can't outcompete. Just a species that's really hard to deal with. Like, for example, the red wolf, which a lot of people recognize as its own species, has a hard time competing with coyotes. So you can find appropriate habitat for red wolves, but the coyote will come in, outcompete it, and begin to mate with the red wolf, and the red wolf eventually becomes diluted genetically. And you get a bunch of hybrid red wolf coyotes walking around. So that's the problem with the red wolf. It's competition mainly. Predation, parasitism, disease. Sometimes you can't live in a certain area because of high levels of predation. There's a predator that's just so effective in knocking out the prey can't live there. Parasitism. Sometimes parasites can be such a strong factor, like mange in wolves. The mange can cause wolves to lose fur, and then having loss of fur causes them to freeze and die. Other just disease in general. So these kinds of things, like the hemlock woolly adelgid, it's an insect that's killing our hemlocks. We may not have hemlocks living here in the next 50 years due to disease and parasitism. And then sometimes it's just darn luck. Individuals move to a new and suitable location by chance, and it just works out. So sometimes luck plays a role in where an organism can live. Like, how in the world did tortoises get to the Galapagos Islands, guys? Right? I mean, the Galapagos Islands are several hundred miles off the coast of South America. We think they formed through volcanic activity. There's great evidence to show that. So these islands formed over several thousand years, maybe even longer. And when they first formed, there was nothing living on them. I mean, it was just ocean, and all of a sudden they sort of popped up through volcanic activity, through the cooling of magma, etc. And how in the world did tortoises get out there? Right? Did they float out there? Maybe so. Maybe they floated off of South America and got out there. So that would have been an example of luck, how they got there. So these are factors and limitations on where an organism can live. Physiological stress, competition, predation, etc., and then just darn luck. Okay, let's, or it could be, good luck, right? Good or bad luck. Let's go to another interesting sort of way of looking at things, and that's what we call critical limits. So we're trying to figure out where an organism can live. We'll notice that a critical factor or critical limits has a lot to do with it. Long time ago, a guy named by the name of von Liebig proposed a single factor, and shortest supply relative to demand is the critical factor in a species distribution. For example, you might find that nitrogen in the soil is the critical factor for a certain plant. If nitrogen is not in high enough levels, that plant will not live there. So it is the single most important factor, and it's very in short supply, so there's not much nitrogen around. And so whether you have nitrogen in high enough levels or not is what really determines whether that plant can live in the area or not. However, Shelford expanded Liebig's idea by stating that each environmental factor has both a minimum and maximum level or tolerance limits beyond which a particular species cannot survive or is unable to reproduce. The factor closest to the limits happens to be what we call the critical factor. Okay, so let's say, guys, okay, I got a little space over here. So let's say we are talking about nitrogen levels in the soil. And these are your ranges of tolerance. So this is high nitrogen, above that it's too much, and then below here it's too little. So there's your nitrogen range, and I'll put a little N next to it. So high, that's anything above that's too high, and there's the low spot. Anything below that's too low for the plant to live. All right, and then right next to that you have levels of phosphorus. And let's say your level of phosphorus needs to be at least this high and maybe at least that low. So there's the high point, there's the low point for phosphorus. Okay? And then let's say we have potassium, and the potassium range is a little bit lower. Say from here to here is your potassium range. So anything above this level here is high, and anything below that level is too low. Okay? All right, so of these three factors, phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium, which has the highest range? The phosphorus does, right? It's got to be very, very high. And let's say in your environment, the actual level of phosphorus, okay, so now I'm going to start giving you actual levels of phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium. Let's say the actual level of phosphorus is let's say it's right here. So that's the actual level of phosphorus in the environment. And let's say the actual level of nitrogen is right here, and the actual level of potassium is, say, right here. Okay? So you tell me which of these three would be the critical factor. Would it be potassium, K, N, or P? Nitrogen or phosphorus? Well, actually phosphorus would be the critical factor. All right, now why would it be the critical factor? Because the actual level of phosphorus, guys, is right here, right? That circle. And if you draw the line to that circle, we are just barely at the level needed. I mean, we're right at the bottom of the phosphorus range. So phosphorus, P, is the critical factor. You see, nitrogen, its level is right here. Remember the circle I drew? And it's right in the middle. So actually this soil is perfect for nitrogen, so we're good there. So we got plenty of nitrogen. And the potassium, the circle here, again, this is where the level is. It's right in the middle, so we're good there. So you see how it works? So you have different tolerance limits, as I drew here, these little bars. So that would be your tolerance limit. And then the whatever factor it is that's closest to the edge of the limit there is going to be your critical factor. Again, in this case it was phosphorus. Okay? All right, well let's go now into the next slide, slide 9. So here's another example of what we mean by tolerance limits. So here we've got a species, looks like, it looks like a black swallowtail. These are swallowtail butterflies, very beautiful. They're either probably call them black swallowtails. And you could see we have the zone of intolerance where there are no black swallowtails. And that might be because of a lack of something, like maybe there's just not enough warmth. So this would be, say, way too cold maybe. Okay? And then over here we have another zone of intolerance where maybe it's just too hot, where they just can't live there. Then in between the zone of intolerance and the optimal range, which is the perfect ideal temperature, you have the zone of physiological stress. So right here it would be very warm and a little warmer than the black swallowtail prefers. And this would be quite cool, let's say. And so those are areas where the butterfly can temporarily reside, temporarily live in these zones of physiological stress. They would have a hard time staying in the physiological stress for a long period of time, unless they were able to adapt through evolution, which would take a long time. Probably not. The optimum area is where the species will thrive and reproduce and spend most of its time, and that's where the species is considered abundant. Okay? And all across this whole thing is what we call an environmental gradient. All right? And so it turns out that temperature is a very critical factor, let's just say. Again, it could have been anything. I just chose temperature. But maybe the critical factor for this population is the presence of a certain food item, like an algae. All right, let's go to slide 10 on critical limits. Again, expanding on our idea here of critical limits. So for some species, the interaction of several factors rather than a single limiting factor determines biogeographical distribution. So tolerance limits may affect the distribution of young differently than adults, too. That's another little point here. So what really typically happens in nature, guys, is not only do we have zones of tolerance or ranges of tolerance, and we, of course, have maybe critical factors, but oftentimes it's several factors that come together to determine where an organism can live. Like, for example, in the case of the wolf, the biggest issue with the timber wolf is habitat, having enough habitat. So those states like northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota and Montana, all those places have a lot of open space for the wolf to expand and to roam. But it's not just having lots of space that allows timber wolves to live in the northern United States and Canada and a little bit of the West. No, it's also the presence of prey items. So you have to have plenty of open space, you have to have lots of prey items, and road density is a major factor when it comes to wolf distribution. So there are at least 3 or 4 different factors right there that limit where timber wolves can live. So they need to live in places where we have lots of habitat, not too many roads, lots of prey. Typically, a colder season. They're very adapted for colder weather, although they can handle pretty hot weather too. So critical limits all kind of factor in with many different factors to determine where an organism can live. Species requirements and tolerances can be useful indicators of specific environmental characteristics. Like, for example, trout require cool, clean, well-oxygenated water, so their disappearance from a stream may indicate that it is being polluted. So, for example, if I was to go out to a mountain stream and it's always had brook trout, which is a native of this area, the rainbow and the brown trout are not native to this area. The brown trout came from Europe. The rainbow trout is from the western United States. So they're not really supposed to live here, but we stock them anyway. So we have brook trout, and let's say I go out to a stream and the brook trout suddenly are not living there anymore. This would tell me that the stream is either not cool enough anymore for some reason, like maybe there's a factory dumping really warm water to cool off the factory's extra heat. They use a cooling sort of facility, and that results in warmer water, and they dump the warm water into the stream. Now the brook trout are stressed and they die. Could be just a pollutant is getting in there. Could be that the water is not as oxygenated. A big issue around here, guys, is people will they'll clear off vegetation like trees to build a house, and then all of a sudden a bunch of sediment, a bunch of like clay and a lot of soil sediment is getting into the stream, causing it to become cloudy. Trout really struggle when the water is not clean, when you have a lot of particulate matter floating around. Trout don't like muddy streams. And basically our mountain streams will not be muddy if things are left relatively pristine. The only time we get a muddy stream or river around here is because of construction, because of human activities, sometimes because of natural fires, but mostly because of human activities. So the trout can act as an indicator to tell us whether the stream is healthy or not. We're actually going to do a study this semester, guys, where we'll go out into streams and look for macroinvertebrates, which are basically like water bugs, and we'll see whether the stream has certain water bugs. And if it does, well, we'll say that, hey, the stream's pretty healthy. If it doesn't have those macroinvertebrates, then we'll have to be concerned, because we use those little water bugs, those macroinvertebrates, as indicators, you see? Like, for example, if you found that wolves live in an area, you know there must be a lot of habitat, a lot of relatively pristine wilderness, and not too many roads. All right, let's go now to a few other little sort of terms here I think probably you haven't heard of. So let's go to, let's go back up here. Let's see if we could find slide 11. There we go. Let's get rid of all that writing here. Okay, so habitat and ecological niches. Let's go through this kind of quickly here. Habitat is just simply the place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. So the habitat can be very specific or very general. Like, for example, we have generalists, which can live in a very broad habitat and have a very broad niche, or niche, some people pronounce. And specialists have a very specific niche and a very specific habitat typically. The niche describes either the role played by a species or the total set of environmental factors that determine a species' distribution. So you could say something like a giant panda is a specialist with a narrow niche, because a giant panda only feeds on what? Anybody remember? Yeah, pandas feed only on bamboo, almost exclusively. And they're found in a very limited area in China, right? And I believe it's southeast China, heavily forested area with mountains. And then a brown rat, or something like a raccoon, is a generalist, has a broad niche, can feed on all kinds of things, right? I mean, what will a raccoon eat? Sure, they'll eat everything, right? They'll eat corn, they'll eat meat, they'll eat just about anything you have in your garbage. Even black bears are pretty general compared to pandas. So the organisms, does anybody remember which of these two generally have an easier time, or which of these two are more likely to not be endangered? That's right, the generalists. You're better off being a generalist in most cases. So the generalists typically don't wind up on the endangered species list. Our specialists are all over the endangered species list. So if you look at almost all the species that are endangered right now, or those that have gone extinct, they were specialists with very narrow niches. Okay? So again, habitat keyword, place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. Like the habitat could be the high mountains of Southeast Asia where lots of bamboo is found. That would be the habitat for panda. And the ecological niche, again, is the role they play. So for a panda, it's to consume bamboo, to clear out vegetation. That's one of their major roles, right? Or for a raccoon, it's to scavenge and pick up leftover food items from other animals. They kind of act as nature's garbage men anyway. Also to keep macroinvertebrate levels in check, because they love water bugs and things like crayfish and even fish. All right, let's go now into the next slide, slide 12. All right, well, a lot of people thinking about these types of things came up with this idea of competitive exclusion. Gauss was the one that came up with the idea of the principle of competitive exclusion, which states that no two species can occupy the same ecological niche at the same time. The one that is more efficient at using the resources will exclude the other. Okay? So, for example, let's say we have gray squirrels and red squirrels living in an area, and they overlap a little bit. Well, gray squirrels and red squirrels eat very similar foods. So where they overlap, the population was going to sort of have a battle. There's going to be a battle between the gray and the red squirrels in terms of survival, sometimes even direct confrontation. Eventually, though, either the gray or the red squirrel will probably wind up winning out. Okay, that's the idea of the competitive exclusion. So two species that have very similar niches, like two squirrels, will have a very difficult time living in the same place at the same time. There may be a temporary period of time where they overlap, but eventually one will outcompete the other. So maybe the gray squirrel winds up winning. Resource partitioning is the idea that species coexist in a habitat by utilizing different parts of a single resource. So for example, although swallows and bats eat the same things, they actually have a very similar niche. The difference is swallows eat during the day and bats eat at night. That's resource partitioning. So though they do have a very similar niche and very similar habitat in many cases, because they feed at different times, they don't compete head to head. And so they're allowed to live in the same area. So a way to get by the principle of competitive exclusion is to go through this resource partitioning. I'll give you another example. Red maple and sugar maple. Well, these trees obviously are very similar. They're both maples. They have a very similar niche. However, the red maple produces its fruits in the springtime, and the sugar maple produces its fruits in the fall. So they can compete less by producing fruits at different times. All right, let's now go to slide 13, picture of resource partitioning. So in this slide, all of these birds live in a very similar area. They have the same habitat or very similar habitat, and they have very similar niche. These are all insect eaters. All of these warblers eat insects. However, the Cape May warbler is found at the tops of the trees, and along with the Blackburnian warbler, and then the yellow-rumped warbler tends to be found in the lower part of the forest, in the thicker part, base of the tree. And of course the others kind of in the middle. So they live in the same area. They forage at different heights. Therefore, they can live in the same area without competing too much. So this is another example of resource partitioning. Just by feeding at different heights, they don't compete too much then, and that allows them to live in the same environment at the same time. So that does not violate competitive exclusion. All right, let's now expand what we've talked about here in evolution and some of this competition and natural selection. Now let's expand this maybe to this level of what we call speciation. Can an organism adapt so much to a new environment that it becomes so different from the way it was that it actually becomes a new species? Well, that's the idea of speciation, that a whole new species can develop from an original species. So this can occur because of geographic isolation, where a subpopulation becomes separated from the main population and can no longer share genes with it. The new population evolves independently, creating a new species. This is called allopatric speciation. This is what we think may have happened with the Galapagos Islands, right? So you have South America, and again, here's my bad drawing of South America. Probably looks more like Africa. But anyway, that's South America. Let's say the Galapagos Islands are off the coast here. And, of course, there's Central America, and that leads on up to North America, and there's Florida here. Okay, anyway, bad drawing, but let's just kind of go with it. So you've got some species that finally get out to these tiny islands. So maybe it's the tortoises. They float out here, okay? Maybe that's how they got out there. Something got them out there, right? So these tortoises get out to the Galapagos, and now the tortoises are separated from the tortoises on the mainland over here. Over time, they'll develop different mutations, right? Remember, mutations are random. So some mutations are going to just pop up in the tortoises on the Galapagos, like maybe the notch in the shell. And that mutation may never occur here on the mainland. And then over time, you wind up seeing turtles that look quite different on the islands compared to the mainland, so much that they might even become a new species. That's the idea of allopatric speciation. There's a geographic separation and isolation that causes them to become different. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at another example, and this is an example that came from the real world. This is probably what we might see out west. So here in the east, so this is kind of what we see here in the eastern United States. We have the gray squirrel, and the gray squirrel lives on this mountain, down here in the valleys, all over the place, single population. However, because of drying, or it could be human development down here in the valleys, they become isolated. This is what we see in the western United States. So in the west, we have forested mountains where squirrels can live up here. And then we have desert, and this desert area creates a barrier. The squirrels have a hard time crossing these long stretches of desert, which could be several miles long. And so in the west, we have lots of populations of squirrels. In the east, we don't have nearly as many. In the east, we have the gray squirrel, we have the fox squirrel, and the red squirrel in the high elevations. But in the west, boy, I can't even list them all for you guys out of memory. There's so many. So the idea is that the squirrel populations out west are on these little islands of habitat. These mountains are kind of like islands separated by oceans of desert. And so because they become isolated and separated, they become different species. So in this particular example, we start off with a gray squirrel all over the place, and then the squirrels become isolated from each other, and some develop lighter fur colors like this one on the left, and others maybe stay the same color. And so that is allopatric speciation, geographically separated populations. And human beings can kind of do this too. We can create islands of habitat through development. So it's not just because of the weather, like the deserts. It could be that we have built cities down here in these valleys. And so we might contribute to allopatric speciation without even knowing it. All right, guys, let's go now to sympatric speciation. And this will be the last slide, and then we'll watch a brief video. Sympatric speciation is where one organism continues to live in the same place but becomes isolated by some other means. Like, for example, some fern species have doubled their numbers of chromosomes they have. This prevents them from breeding with the population from which they originally came and effectively creates a new species. So in sympatric speciation, it's not geographic isolation that leads to different species evolving. It's caused by one species slowly changing over time into a new one, or in the case of plants, it can happen pretty quickly, where we suddenly have a doubling of the number of chromosomes. That's called a duplication event, and that can happen overnight. And this prevents them from breeding with populations from which they originally came. The video will explain more how that can happen. So let's go ahead without further delay and look at our last video, which is just a few minutes long, 3 minutes and 28 seconds, and then we'll wrap it up, guys, and we'll call it Lecture 3A.
New species evolve by a number of mechanisms, which are generally categorized as either allopatric, sympatric, or parapatric speciation mechanisms. Select an option to view. Allopatric speciation requires total genetic isolation by geographic separation. For example, a population of rodents could transfer seeds of the plant to a neighboring valley. The isolated plants must adapt to a different environment. Over time, they develop different traits than the parent population. Eventually, the two populations will not be able to interbreed. Thus, the isolated population has evolved into a new species. New species evolve by a number of mechanisms, which are generally categorized. Sympatric speciation occurs without physical separation, most commonly by an increase in a plant's number of chromosomes. When an organism gains additional chromosomes, it's called polyploid. Here, we describe the making of a type of polyploid called an allopolyploid. Our plant might interbreed with another plant species in the area. Each of these plants is diploid, but one has 2 pairs of chromosomes and the other has 3 pairs. Although these plants are of 2 distinct species, they can mate. Their haploid gametes fuse to form a hybrid zygote. The hybrid plant can develop, but will likely be sterile, since the mix of chromosomes cannot pair during meiosis. However, a rare mitotic error could occur in the reproductive tissue, doubling the number of chromosomes in a cell. Now, each chromosome can be paired with a homologous chromosome during meiosis. Meiosis proceeds normally in the polyploid reproductive organs, resulting in gametes with 5 chromosomes each. Self-fertilization produces a fertile hybrid plant, an allopolyploid. The allopolyploid is a new species which can reproduce and thrive. New species evolve. Parapatric speciation results from reproductive isolation between adjacent members of a population. Suppose one edge of the valley becomes a dumping ground for DDT waste. This abrupt change in environment will be mostly destructive to plant growth. Strong selective pressure could lead to a DDT-resistant population. The resistant plants may not be able to breed with the adjacent non-resistant plants. In this case, natural selection was stronger than gene flow, resulting in a new plant species.
Okay, guys, so you've seen some different types of speciation, some different ways that we can develop a whole new species. All right, guys, well, look, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to just email me at mspath@wpcc.edu, or you can always bring your questions to class, where I will see you next.